get started. And I apologize, I'm looking over at this screen, clicking the admit button because the only way we don't have to have a passcode, which hasn't worked for us in the past. Anyway, so I wanted to welcome you all. So many of you are members of the TLUH committee. Some of you are guests of this committee, so thank you for joining us and for this meeting and being here. My name is Nathan Spencer. I am Executive Director with WakeUp Wake County. We are, for those that don't know, we're a 17-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit organization funded by individuals just like you, hint, hint, and grant makers and foundation makers and foundations. Our work has centered around handling growth as the triangle expands over the last decade and a half and further, and how we sort of are intelligent and intentional about our growth, aiming to get to make sure that all people are able to enjoy what we're trying to build in the triangle. So within that means WakeUp was one of the champions behind the Wake Transit Plan back in 2016, which led us to where we are in this discussion today of bus rapid transit. The Wake Transit Plan is the half-cent sales tax that you will see when you're buying anything. And there's a little line item that says sales tax for transit, and that's going to, that brings in about $108 million a year for us to be able to expand and build transit around the triangle, and specifically to build projects like the bus rapid transit. So today we're going to explore what that future looks like. Raleigh specifically is working on transit overlay districts. So this conversation is timely, and we're excited to have this. And I pride myself on being a knowledgeable person, but I know a little bit about a lot of things. So when it comes to having an expert in the room, it's amazing to have someone like Molly Stuart with us. Molly is not only vice chair of the WakeUp board, but she's an attorney at Morningstar Law Group, where she's been for 6 years, and she is a partner there. She has a BA in economics and environmental studies from Kenyon College, a master's in city and regional planning from Ohio State University, and a JD from Harvard Law School. So she comes with immense amount of practicing knowledge and experience within the theory and how things are supposed to work. So she's not only worked in a lot of different areas, but also has trained and learned how best to make this stuff work. So she has agreed to let us have a question or a conversation on this study and its impact on the region. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly now.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Appreciate that introduction. So I think you all know that we're here today to talk about a particular academic study, which is what makes this this fairly large group today extremely impressive. I appreciate you all being here. This is a pretty wonky topic to be diving into. So my challenge today is to sort of put that in English so that, you know, as a community, we can have a conversation about it. I absolutely see that there are many experts in many fields who are here with us, who know a lot about the many different fields that touch on a topic as complex as BRT and what its effects are kind of throughout the region. So I will go ahead and share my screen. And it's always harder than it sounds. Okay, I'll make that slideshow. I think, there we go. Okay, so this is the study that we're looking at today. This came out last year. Nathan, do we have anyone kind of calling in, or can everyone see my screen?
I think we have a couple call-ins, but this will be recorded, and we'll put it up on YouTube. So if folks want to go back and take a look, they can.
Thank you. Okay, great. That just informs kind of what I can assume about what people can see. So the study is called Impacts of Bus Rapid Transit BRT on Residential Property Values, a comparative analysis of 11 US BRT systems. And why we're doing this today, why we would ever bring an academic study to this particular table is because it's really the first of its kind in an area where we need information very badly, and there just hasn't been much that we can rely on. So we finally we're starting to be able to read the tea leaves. I don't want to overstate this and say that, we have a solid conclusion that we can absolutely point to. So, but we did learn some things from this study. So it's worth kind of bringing to this group. The authors, Acton, Lee, and Miller from The Ohio State University, go Buckeyes, and in their Department of Geography. And this was published last year in the Journal of Transport Geography. So we're going to dive into what they found in their study. But before doing that, this study, being as narrow and as wonky as it is, requires a lot of context. So I will be providing that as well. And I'm sure many of you can add to that once we get into the discussion portion of this. So why are we talking about this? Why are you here? I imagine there are a few key reasons that you're here. Maybe you're just generally curious about BRT and the big change that's coming. I suspect many of you have been involved with it for a while now. And maybe you're curious on a personal level. Maybe you are interested in what this might do to your property values. I suspect many in this group are interested, as I am, from a policy perspective. What are the facts on which we should base our policies, sort of large scale? So that is my interest in this topic. And, just to really drive home this point, and I'll do it probably half a dozen times today, is that, they're putting together BRT and its impacts is a large puzzle. We are really zooming in on one piece of that puzzle today. So very, very focused on the piece that we're looking at. There are many, many factors to consider here. So I'll start with kind of a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today, sort of the major points, and just sort of give you kind of the big picture. So you probably wouldn't be here if you're not familiar with BRT generally. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on there, but I am going to define it because the way it's defined is important to the study itself. It's a very particular definition. Then I'll move on and talk about why is the question of property value impacts in particular fairly central to the discussion of BRT. And it's something that does come up a lot, even here locally in our conversations about BRT. Another question I know everyone's interested in is, how does this relate to the Wake County plan for BRT? And where's the overlap between this study and what we're doing here locally? Kind of almost a fake question. Will this study tell me if BRT is a good idea? You all know the answer to that. But we're going to talk about why it can't tell you that. And then finally, of course, what does the study say? So, and that's where I'll spend most of my time. That's not sort of, the trick at the end. That is where we'll spend a good chunk of our time today is what did the study tell us? So to provide that background, what is BRT? We're going to talk about the study's definition of that. So you see on your screen kind of the four big components of BRT. There are others certainly, but the four you see on their screen are part of the study's definition of what makes a BRT. At the top left, you see those dedicated lanes. They also include, some systems actually have a separate busway where it's not really a street that cars are on at all, really just buses, that's also sort of thrown in the same bucket as a dedicated lane. Really just anytime that bus doesn't have to weave in and out of traffic. And that's really a critical point. We're going to come back to that one. At the top right of your screen, you see that off-board fare payment, really important to keeping the system moving quickly. At the bottom left is that signal controller, so these buses aren't waiting at traffic lights. And at the bottom right, you have an elevated station and an enhanced station. So there's level boarding and sort of something very visible, very comfortable to use. Those are kind of the four big pieces. Now this study, because it is focused on the United States, also looks at some systems that don't have that first piece, that dedicated bus lane. So because it is also looking at some of those systems, it assigns those the name BRT Lite. So it's going to look at both BRT systems as well as BRT Lite. So those are kind of both included here, and you'll be able to see the differences there, but just want to make sure everyone's on the same page there. The next question is, why are we looking at property values? Why is this so important to the discussion of BRT? Probably most of you have already spotted that what we're looking at here is not a BRT at all. That's a light rail. And the reason it's on your screen is because it really feeds into kind of the history of how we got here. In the 1990s, early 2000s, there was sort of a wave of cities building these light rail systems. And of course, those were studied. And then what they learned is that as a general rule, these systems did increase property values along their corridor. So that's something that that we know from the light rail studies that were done. So of course, the next natural question, now that people are moving on to BRT systems, doing fewer light rail systems, is does the same effect apply? Does the BRT have similar effects on property values as light rail did? So this is interesting. And in fact, the question of property values is particularly interesting because, as a general rule, many of you know this, people are concerned when there's new development or new infrastructure. People are most concerned that that's going to hurt their property value. What is this going to do to my property value, right? My house is my biggest investment. So what's going to happen there? You hear that all the time. That is still true for BRT. That is absolutely one part of the conversation about property values. But there is another side to that question. This isn't just about people being concerned that their property values will be hurt. But what if this public investment actually increases property values, especially residential property values? And just a reminder, this study is focused on residential property values, not commercial. And one reason for that is that property values determine property taxes, as well as feed into rents for apartments as well. So it's really as simple as that. Any rise in property values really kind of cuts both ways, and it affects different people differently. So we kind of have a couple of groups of people. So even if you're only looking at nearby residents, you have a couple of groups. If you are a property owner, and you either can afford to pay increased property taxes, or you're happy to sell your property, well then absolutely an increase in property value is a great thing, right? So that's money in the bank for you. These property value increases over time, for whatever reason, are often the foundation of generational wealth. So a lot of good coming of that, depending on who you are. So then there are other nearby residents who don't benefit. You've got tenants, for example. So by itself, an increase in property value really doesn't benefit tenants. It can hurt them because their landlords' annual costs go up. Those feed directly into the rents. It doesn't benefit that tenant. It can also kind of feed directly into the rent just because the property is valued more highly. So that's a tougher situation. Also, there are owners in the area who might like to stay, but who can't afford any increase in their property taxes. So, someone else who could potentially get forced out. So a lot of different possibilities for how any increase in property value could affect different people. And this is sort of where the conversation is, sort of what happens in that situation. So both of these directions of impact are important, and which one is more salient in a particular location, it depends on the situation of the surrounding property owners. So if you're hearing, for example, that BRT will cause gentrification, this is the concern, right? It's going to raise property values because of this public investment and cause a cascade of effects from there, most directly through those property taxes, but certainly not alone. So that's sort of how this kind of sits in the local conversation. So the next piece is, how does this relate to the Wake County Transit Plan for BRT? And I have a few main points here. I'm sure you all know that there are 4 BRT routes planned. One, I believe, still breaking ground this year. Nathan, is that right? Okay, so Newbern Avenue, the first one in line, breaking ground this year. So we have these 4 lines planned. These are planned to be high quality BRT lines. And so here you see a portion of the Newbern line by Wake Med. So you see those dedicated bus lanes, you see those enhanced stations, the level boarding, you see all of that here. So this absolutely fits within the kind of universe of systems that this study has looked at. Another point I want to raise about what this study is not looking at, and that's zoning. So what you see on your screen right now, this is a transit overlay district that the city of Raleigh is putting in place. The green areas that you see highlighted here, these have already had an overlay applied to them. And so these are along BRT routes. They do a number of things, probably most critically provide a height bonus for affordable housing or for job creation, those kinds of things. So that's what that is about. The city is also in the process of working to add that same overlay along the Newbern corridor. So that is another, an entirely separate policy. So the study that we're looking at today is looking at the effect of the physical infrastructure of the BRT and the BRT service itself. It is not looking at any sort of zoning that may have gone with that. So this is excluded. So I just want to be very clear about that, because at this exact moment in time, I think a lot of the conversation is about this overlay, at least in Raleigh. And that is not really what the study was looking at. So I just want to separate those two topics and highlight that for you. So will the study tell me if BRT is a good idea? So here are the 11 systems the city is looking at. And you can see there are different types of systems here, and they sort of color coded them, and you have dots and squares and all of that. So the oranges and the blues, those are those full BRTs we talked about with the dedicated lanes. And then we have several of the BRT light systems as well. And just sort of one more point in this talk where I want to mention that we are, again, only looking at those property values. And that is not, I want to just quickly mention, that is not synonymous with what is the overall impact on residents. There are other sources of impact on residents besides property values. And we are really narrowly looking through the microscope right now at those property values. You know, residents may value, maybe they can get rid of a car or something like that. That's a very different impact on them than these property value impacts. So just throwing that out one more time before we go into the actual study. So as they were looking at these 11 cities, so here are those systems that they looked at in more of a list, and a couple things I want to point out about this list. So over on the right-hand side of your screen is where you can see whether they were a true BRT system, and those are noted silver, bronze, and basic, or a BRT light system, and we talked about the difference there. So there are only about half a dozen in the study that are true BRT systems, and we will kind of look at those separately from the BRT light systems, and that's what's most important. One technical point to be aware of, so many of these systems, including those planned here locally, have dedicated lanes, and the question as to whether they kind of make it into the BRT and pass the BRT light standard there has to do with whether more than 50% of the routes are within their own lanes, or whether they're in mixed traffic for the majority of the route. So, so that's really the technical difference between those. You know, a portion of our own local system would also be in sort of mixed traffic, as well as having those dedicated lanes. So we have a hybrid too, and many of these are hybrid systems as well. So just kind of highlighting what we're looking at here. When they looked at these lines, the way the study was set up is they looked at property transactions, and they looked at property transactions for residential properties within 800 meters of a BRT station. That's about half a mile, so about the outer edge of the walkable area to the station. They looked at all the property transactions in that area, and they had a data set that started in 1990. It went through 2016. Most of these systems, I think you have this. Yeah, so you have the years here. These these all came in after 1990. So they looked at data from the beginning, the month after the BRT system actually was up and running. So they, you know, whatever that date was in the local area, they looked at all the transactions from that date on, going into the future up to 2016. So that's the data set that they were looking at. And they also created a control group. And the way that they did this, it's always very fuzzy in a social science like economics, to come up with data that is very clear, very comparable. And so the way they created a control group was they matched these areas with similar neighborhoods, and they did that based on 15 different attributes to just find neighborhoods that were most similar to those around the BRT lines, really trying to isolate as much as possible, the only difference being the existence of that BRT service. So comparing, you know, property transactions in one neighborhood with BRT versus another extremely similar neighborhood without BRT, and what's the difference. And so the idea there being that hopefully they're at least minimizing the extent to which they're picking up any overall differences in how property values have changed in those areas. So that is how the study was designed and what they were looking at. So we are finally getting to some results. And here's the first screen of results. Let's take a little tour of the screen because there's a lot going on here. Okay, so you see the cities listed over there on the left. There's that white horizontal line through your screen that separates the BRT from the BRT light at the bottom. So different types of systems there. So the exact, those black dots with the numbers on them, that's sort of, you know, the data spits out a number as far as, you know, the impact was X%, and those are those numbers. But the bars associated with those numbers, those are kind of the range where we can be confident that the real number is somewhere in the bar, right? So it's probably not honestly exactly where the dot is, but somewhere in that bar is the actual percentage effect of BRT. So that's what we know. And anytime that bar crosses the zero line, so that dotted vertical line is zero effect. And then to the left of it, you have the negative effects of BRT. To the right of it, you have the positive effects of BRT. And anytime that bar crosses zero, we can't say there's any effect of BRT. And if there is an effect, we can't say what direction it goes in. So it might be zero. So that's what all the gray bars are telling us. We can't tell the difference between BRT and non-BRT neighborhoods and what direction the effect might go. And really what that tells us is we didn't find one. In all of those areas where they have gray bars, no overall effect was found from the BRT system. So that's one thing to point out. Now they did find some. So where they are green, that is considered statistically significant. We know the effect is non-zero. We don't know exactly where it is, but the green ones are positive. So that means property values increased in those local areas. And then the red, we had one that decreased as well. So still we're on either side of that zero line. And so we can talk a little bit about the different cities involved here, because it's actually kind of interesting what's going on. Cleveland is an outlier. Getting us back to the age-old question, what in the world is going on in Cleveland? No one knows. I'll admit I'm from Cleveland, by the way. I have seen this line. It's a great line. It meets the highest BRT standard that we have in the United States today. It's a silver standard, and that's a whole reference book that you can look at and see what different BRTs qualify. It's separate from our talk today, but it is a very high standard for a BRT line, and it has a noticeable effect, a noticeable positive effect. How noticeable? We don't know. That bar is very long. We really don't know what the absolute number is there, but certainly positive in Cleveland. I don't have a lot of theories on that. I'd love to hear from some others who might. Pittsburgh is interesting. They do not love the BRT in Pittsburgh. At least they don't want to live near it. I understand from the study they mentioned that in Pittsburgh in particular, this line is on a busway, so kind of separate from traffic and surrounded by park and rides. For the most part, the stations are surrounded by sort of large parking areas. So that may or may not explain why they might be less attractive to live near than some of the other stations that are more integrated into kind of the flow of the community. So just something interesting about Pittsburgh. I also thought it was especially interesting that Oakland and Seattle, so our BRT light systems that had positive effects, are also two cities really known for terrible traffic congestion, where you might really value a dedicated bus lane. So interesting that those came up positive, not so much the case in other cities. So these are the overall results, but the authors further broke this down for us. So this is for all residential properties. They broke it down so that we can also look at multifamily properties versus single family homes. So here now we're looking at just the multifamily properties. And this is also an interesting result, I thought. So Cleveland, again, just running away with it here. The multifamily properties really love that BRT, apparently. And so as we think through the impacts, going back to why are we talking about this? Who does this affect? One, we can see that, the owners here might be happy or indifferent by an increase in property value because there's, going to be larger owners, possibly corporate, owners of apartments. And so the tenants, who knows what the impact was there. That is probably a separate study, but we could guess that those rents probably went up. So just noting that about Cleveland. But then you see kind of a mixed bag elsewhere. So Oakland, again, traffic's terrible. We see that going up. Less so in Seattle. Everett really didn't care for its BRT regardless. But in general, you see, I would say, a slight trend more positive here. Seems like you get more property value positive impacts out of on these multifamily properties. But what's really interesting is the single family impacts. So here you see what happened to the houses. So when you have a house within about a half mile of a BRT station, what happens there? And it's very different. Here you really start to pick up on where people hate to drive. And that's my theory. So I don't know that we can conclude that. That's not sort of, they didn't really dig into why these are the case, but Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, yes, I want my house to be near that BRT. Not super strongly, by the way. These are small numbers. And when you think about the difference of, if there's a BRT impact on property value, and it's small, like the ones you see here, 2%, 3%, 4%, that's sort of a one-time number. And in those particular areas, Seattle, Oakland, Los Angeles, those are probably dwarfed by the background level of property value appreciation due to other factors, right, that happen every single year. And so these are real, statistically significant, but quite small given the overall growth in property values generally. And you also start to see, again, what in the world happened in Cleveland? We don't know. Those single family homes, just really different from every other result we saw. And possibly that's picking up on, I know this is a system that comes right into the heart of downtown through one of the most dense areas. So this sort of, we're getting out to the fringes here of the system. And there, people don't want to be near it. Maybe they prefer to drive. Maybe the bus is getting in their way. So so not a great impact there. Other places, Miami and Pittsburgh, we don't like our single family homes necessarily to be near the BRT. Again, not huge impacts, but losing 11% of your property value because of the BRT is not insignificant. So really interesting. Not only I would say the overall lack of significance of these numbers, we saw a lot of what they call null results, right? Where we didn't get an answer. The answer might be 0. I don't want to say we didn't get an answer. That is an answer, right? So where we can't pick up, we can't identify an impact. That was a theme that we see overall. Where it's positive, it tends to be fairly small. Some exceptions for multifamily. Really no exceptions for single family. We didn't see anything large and positive there. Some possible negatives. So it's an interesting study. This is, again, for context, this is the first time we're starting to, peer into those tea leaves or, just start to get a glimpse of what these impacts might look like. A lot more information is needed. Hopefully, we can add to this data set and start to see more, but it's really helpful that the authors have been able to pull all this data and start to pull out some themes that they've noticed. So this is kind of state of the art as far as what we know today about impacts of BRT. BRT systems certainly haven't been around in the United States my whole life, and so they're kind of a newer thing that we're just getting our arms around. But it seems like we're starting to learn that these are not, at least what's driving what happens to property values generally in many of these areas. So that's what we found out. And back to put it into, sort of what are the overall effects of BRT on residents? Although we focus so narrowly on property value today, that's the yellow box there in the middle. And as we saw, it sort of comes out in the middle, right? We don't really know the impact. It's fairly small. It's kind of in the middle. It might be positive, might be negative, depending on the situation. So kind of sitting there in the middle. I don't want to exclude the fact that there are potential nuisance effects. Certainly, the residents of Pittsburgh feel there are nuisance effects of the BRT. Depending on what kinds of buses you use, you could have, noise or whatever the issues are. Perhaps it's just the number of users being right there in your neighborhood. Who knows? But probably there's a negative. There are negative effects, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, some things that are likely to be positive about BRT that don't necessarily get captured in those property values. So, any resident, regardless of which group they're in here, living near a BRT station might, face lower transportation costs in general. Maybe they can get rid of a car. Parking costs I pulled out of that for 2 reasons. One, because, it's part of transportation because they may not have to take a car and go pay to park it somewhere else. But also that can feed into the costs of rental units in particular, where, the developers don't have to include parking spaces that are expensive. And so it can impact the housing costs as well through that mechanism. And that's one that happens over time, right? So that's not one that's going to happen the day the BRT opens, but over time, it's possible that we could spend less to build all different types of housing because we aren't having to provide so much parking with that housing. The next one, the concentration of employment and services. Here, this kind of goes on the idea similar to light rail, where uses start to congregate along these lines. And you see, the city of Raleigh at least is trying to encourage that with the zoning that they're putting in, trying to encourage concentration, which again makes that transportation easier. If all the things you need to get to are along the BRT line, it's kind of this virtuous cycle, and starts to concentrate everything along that. It also provides a target. So by itself, BRT can make overall costs of living more or less expensive, depending on how rent plays out versus transportation. But those together, we can't really say anything about today. But it can provide a target for interventions. So kind of public interventions like the city of Raleigh is doing, sort of saying, and we want affordable housing in this location specifically. So it kind of allows that to be directed and in places where people don't also, need to drive very far and can get to employment, can get to services easily. So lots and lots of effects. I am sure I have left a dozen others off of this screen, but really just trying to put in context that how that property value plays into the much larger discussion. It's an important piece, no question. And just want to make sure that we understand what the study does and does not do. So with that, I will stop talking and let's have a conversation. And I can go ahead and stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Molly. One question I have right off the bat, or one piece before we get into the questions that I noticed was from the study. They mentioned that Cleveland ended up putting $7 billion worth of investment post development of the BRT. And one of the things that I remember from when Raleigh went to tour the Pulse system in Richmond was that the comment that they got from Richmond was we're doing the zoning too late. So it's interesting to me to look at these numbers and think about whether the increase in multifamily property values along Cleveland is that they maybe were putting so much in that it was driving up the cost in a sort of almost a not an inflated sort of way. So that's interesting. So I think one of the questions that, and I realize we can't necessarily pull an apples to apples, but what are some of the lessons that we can pull from this to look towards the triangle as we start to develop our BRT?
It's a great question. So, we have to start making some guesses about where we fall in that, which is the most similar system, which is the most similar city. We don't have today, we don't have the traffic congestion pressures that Oakland and LA face. So, we're probably going to be a little different from those. However, we're putting in a high quality system. So, hard to say, and when we do that, we're going to have to look at short term, the Raleigh everyone knows, and long term. Maybe we are heading toward something more along those lines. Hard to say with the rate that we're growing. So we're going to want to keep that in mind. It's actually really helpful to see that difference, to see that over time this can become very valuable if something else goes terribly wrong, which is traffic congestion. So just something we're going to have to be aware of, and you in your role on RTA in particular, probably have better information about which of these systems looks most like ours. And I'm not sort of deeply aware of all the details of ours yet. So I would be interested to see, okay, which city or cities should we be following closely and looking at their impacts.
Okay. And as we start to develop our transit overlay districts around and start to look at density, I'm curious if there was anything we could read out of the study that would give us an understanding of the correlation between density around transit and the effect on property values versus the not density, like you mentioned, the parking spaces around Pittsburgh and stuff like that.
There are so many more questions this study opens up to us. Right? That being one of them. You know, they showed these differences between cities, and it's almost a black box. What's in there? We don't know. We just don't know what necessarily is driving those differences. You heard some speculation from me today. You know, admittedly, I do not know if it's because of traffic congestion or it's some other factor. And when you hear speculations, those are just questions waiting to be answered, right? So many more studies to be done. And you know, we're in a situation where, you know, you don't want to come in afterward and do BRT. It's so much harder, but it's a sliding scale of, you know, we don't have all the information, and to some extent we are creating it as we go. So we can start to see the signs and try our best to come up with policies to address things that might be issues. And hopefully, you know, I think a takeaway from this study is we're not seeing giant screaming red flags, right? That's something we're not seeing out of this study necessarily. That's great to know. You know, we would probably react very differently if that's what came out of this study. But it does point to some theories for things that could make a difference in the BRT. So, you know, are we trying to make traffic congestion in order to make BRT an attractive thing? No. No, we're not. You know, it's actually sort of a relief that, you know, we seem to be in the bucket of cities where the impacts to residents are probably not going to be sort of, you know, off the charts or really anywhere near that kind of background change in property value.
I think that was my next question was there any screaming like warning signs for residents, but you answered that. Yolanda has raised her hand. Yolanda, do you have a question?
Thanks. I kind of like have a question and a comment. First, I want to thank Molly. Molly, you know, I love you. I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation today and grounding this discussion around BRT. Of course, you know, I've voiced opinions around BRT, but I don't think any of us have the actual data. So what I was going to say is that based on this study, you know, like you say, we're not these cities. I think if it's possible, we probably need to take a more regional approach to like determine like what methodology do we need to employ in order to collect data. I mean, I would think that census tract data will be important, like, you know, looking at the census tracts as to where the BRT project is being built, looking at the demographics, you know, of that census tract. You know, we have some stories from residents who have gone on the news like WRAL to talk about, you know, that they feel like the communities, like for example, around New Bern are not stabilized and that there's already has been displacement. But the other factor too that wasn't mentioned in this report is that, you know, according to the equitable development around transit guidebook that Raleigh put together, like you say, it didn't take into account zoning tools or equity tools. So I think we do have that working for us in the fact that we have some great equity tools, you know, in place. I will concede that. Just, you know, determining how we're going to implement that, how we're going to roll that out. But I think a closer look regionally, looking at census tract data, being able to really measure, if we can, you know, what displacement has occurred. It's an area already unstable. And like you were saying, we are seeing unprecedented growth in this area too. So has there already been displacement? But I do want to say, as it relates to taxes, I do a lot of legislative bill tracking as part of my work. There is a bill that's going through the Senate now, is S92, that's going to expand the circuit breaker tax relief and take away the requirement that you have to be 65 or disabled. You still will have to be probably low income. But, you know, a lot of folks like One Wake, you know, who have been on the ground fighting for this tax relief, you know, tools like that will be important too. So I just want to say thank you. It's a good way to ground it. I've read some studies too, you know, like they say statistics and damn statistics, you know, like you can always like find like studies against studies, but I think, you know, just looking at what we're doing here will be very important.
Thank you. I was actually not aware of that bill. I really appreciate you bringing that to all our attention.
That's really awesome. I put it in the chat so others can take a look, and as an advocacy organization, one of our reminders is to get in touch with your elected officials and, your local delegation, having comments on this if you do. First, I should ask you if anyone else has any questions based on what we've been discussing. Please raise your hand in the Zoom system when you do. One sort of point that I think you and Yolanda had mentioned that I think is really interesting, that's worth sort of highlighting, is that the work that Raleigh has specifically started with the equitable development around transit and looking at density and how we operate some of this is also reflected in some of the legislation that we've seen come from the federal government in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so there's something to be said about the fact that we're on the sort of the if not the cutting edge, the moving edge of this, where we're working ahead of some of this stuff, which is great to see. But part of the difficulty on being on the leading edge of that is that we don't necessarily know its effect. Do we know that it's going to work, or are we, sort of putting band-aids on things along the way? But I do know that a lot of the idea behind the bipartisan infrastructure law recommendations for zoning changes is based on the idea that when we do big public infrastructure projects, that we're not creating the same problems that our parents did when, or our grandparents, I should say, with highways, in where we're splitting neighborhoods and creating problems that we 70 years later go back and say, oh no, we shouldn't have done that. So Kim, you have your hand raised. You're still on mute, Kim.
No, I know. I'm working from an iPhone, so I don't do this often, because I'm going to tell you, I've spent a lot of time as a single, stay-at-home mom, and now I'm a single stay-at-home mom. So pardon me, I'm not one of the experts in the room, and I certainly hope I'm not intruding where I'm not allowed to be. A neighbor, I live on Edenton Street in the 500 block, and I had kind of a multi-part question, and I have been following the BRT somewhat, but this isn't my job. So I haven't spent as much time until recently, when my neighbors and I discovered we'd already been rezoned. And I know that's not what this call is about. But my questions are, watching the plan, and I think Molly's actually a neighbor not too far from me. But my questions are, with all of these unknowns, and I was one of the people who was I've been here for 23 years, same neighborhood. And there's so many unknowns. I voted for the 0.5 cent sales tax increase for light rail. That fell apart. Real excited about our line. My impression is that's not successful. I don't have the data on that. And culturally, it just seemed like people were not using the R line. But with all of the unknowns, including the screaming red flag to me is Pittsburgh. So we are moving forward, and I feel like there's so many unknowns, whether it's climate impact, and today's study that we've looked at, the changes to property values are very unknown. And so I don't know why I want to know how this seems very risky and a very large undertaking and very expensive with so many unknowns. And why can we not speak to the Cleveland tenants that when the property's values went up, Molly even said it's most likely those tenants moved out because rents went up, most likely, but we don't have a study, or we don't have any data or facts on that. So the unknown piece, I want to know why, and how are we going to try and get answers to some of those. And somebody, I think it was Molly, had mentioned what makes it harder to do later than we are now, because I sit in my living room window and watch underutilized buses, not 50% full, ride by frequently. I see no traffic congestion whatsoever. I lived for years in Washington, D.C., worked and lived in the Central Business District. I spent a whole year commuting and working in Atlanta. Now that's traffic congestion. We don't have anything like that. So I know that the BRT is supposed to serve other purposes than traffic congestion, but we're nowhere near any of that. So what makes it harder? I'm worried about the cultural aspects of this area with bus riding. Is just not something we do, and it's just not a frequent thing. The other thing I'm worried, and this is kind of the last part of my question, is we talked about light rail all these years, and as residents, we were excited about that because of the connectivity between, we keep saying the triangle, but what I've seen with BRT, it's city focused, and I understand there's the Wake County BRT that would be, outside the city of Raleigh perhaps, but I haven't seen much information on that. But we were interested in connecting to Durham, to RTP. And the BRT doesn't seem to do that. So is there already a plan in place for the BRT we're talking about today to be connected to other BRTs so we can get to Durham, we can get to the Triangle? That is really more of what would keep people. We don't have a lot of grocery stores downtown. There's not a lot to support a lifestyle other than restaurants and theater and schools. My kids ride their bike to school. They're going to have to cross this rapid bus lane to get to school. It is splitting my neighborhood up, is my impression. So how are we connecting to other areas? How are we moving forward with so many unknowns? And why do we not consider Pittsburgh a screaming red flag? And why have we not identified the city that we would like to follow along with? I hope that makes sense, because truly, I am just a mom.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Go ahead, Mom.
Yeah, no, a lot of good questions there. I caught many of them. I hope I got them all. But first, I just want to start by saying, yes, of course, you're welcome here. All are welcome here. And this is definitely information that we should all be working with. And that's absolutely our goal today, is to, not just sort of email out an academic study and hope everyone can go from there. So yes, thank you for being here. So where to begin? We have a lot of choices in front of us, and I hear that concern. We don't have all the data, right? And so why move forward? And the fact is, we are moving forward in one direction or another, right? And so anything we do from here is making a choice. And if that choice is to not have BRT or another system, if that choice is, we're going to hold the line, we're going to keep growing in the pattern that we're growing, what happens then? I often hear sort of a conclusion that if we don't do whatever it is, any sort of change, in this case BRT, things will stay the same. And that's, in an area growing like ours, that's not one of our choices. And so the question is, what does happen if we don't do BRT? And maybe it's not the best answer. We can't be sure of that as we sort of project out into the future. This is what a lot of people think is the best plan, but who knows? But what happens in the alternative? And it, the fear, I think, that is kind of driving that BRT, at least, is that people get pushed farther and farther out, all have to drive in. Ultimately, we start turning these routes into highways anyway, right? They get widened, they take property in any event. So it's not as though the people who would come to this area go away. They just go somewhere else and probably still come through. So it's a really hard question. Either direction we go, we don't have all the information. And so that it just doesn't exist no matter what. We have seen many cities go before us without a solid transit plan. Well, the traffic in Los Angeles is tough. So, this is kind of where that conversation has gone, where it has landed here locally for now. We are absolutely part of the group that is, a group of cities that are trying to figure this out. And so right now, BRT was seen as a balance in, costs and impacts versus trying to do something different, because we didn't think that pure car-based system was going to work very long, given our growth. So a lot of challenges there. But specifically, you'd also asked about connecting to Durham, and actually, before, I want to ping Nathan on that one because he's going to have more information there. But Pittsburgh, I hear you on the Pittsburgh being the red flag. Again, it really depends what group you're in. Do you want to see property values go up or not? And in Pittsburgh, they went down, and I can say that probably most people agree they shouldn't go down. People don't like to lose things. So, we have kind of that bias against losing something we already have. And so we did see that in Pittsburgh, absolutely. And so, I kind of briefly mentioned one possible explanation for that. The Pittsburgh system does look a little different from some of the others. It is, like I said, it's not on parts of it anywhere, not on a street. The part that was studied is in a busway. And so, you just kind of have these lanes that are just buses pulling into essentially large park and ride areas. So not kind of a thriving urban environment where the BRT is knit in with the city and with other uses. But really people are supposed to bring a lot of cars to this area, park there, and then get on this bus and go somewhere else entirely. So almost like an airport parking lot, not super attractive to people. So that is certainly not any part of the plan here. So we don't know the answers. There's not a study that's going to tell us exactly why Pittsburgh had the effect that it had. We don't have the whys yet. We're barely getting to the whats here. So that's a theory. And hopefully we're just not going in the same direction that Pittsburgh is on that one. And then I would like to see if Nathan can tell us where we are with those plans to connect to Durham, because I know there's
and that's a very good question. So one of the things that's being worked on right now is what's being referred to as an extension to the BRT. So the immediate factor is doing the 4 corridors within Raleigh and get those organized. But Campo is actually working on plans for extensions going from Garner to Clayton and from Cary to RTP on BRT. Knightdale put in their 2035 plan that came out in 2018, 2019 about BRT hitting going into downtown Knightdale. So there's an interest from them to also do an extension from New Hope Road towards there. So eventually, and while it's not going to happen in a quick form, as none of this transit happens that fast. But there eventually we will have extensions throughout where folks will be able to get on and get the buses from different areas. Now, one thing I want to note is why this actually is really important to folks like Kim and others is that one of the things that we're all experiencing, I live in East Raleigh, and my home has increased in value in a ridiculous and not anywhere in reality sort of value increase. But one of the things that this can really offer is that as we extend and as we connect this, that creates relief valves for housing, which means that folks, not only folks who can afford it, can live further out, but the folks who can live further out and want and can afford it will be able to buy, their larger land and be able to get in faster, which also creates a way for folks to not have homes bought out from underneath them and sort of torn up and turned into large scale sort of McMansions that could house multiple families. The idea that we could actually have ways to get from New Hope Road to downtown Raleigh in 19 minutes on bus rapid transit will allow folks then to be able to look at that and say, well, okay, I don't want to deal with parking, or, I do want to just jump on this other bus that will get me to New Hope Road in 10 minutes, and then I can be downtown very quickly. So there's a lot of opportunity within there. I hope that answers that question. Evan, you raised your hand. Do you have something to add or a question?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for for putting this this together. This was a really interesting paper to read, and and Kim, thank you for all the really valid concerns that you bring to the table. I think one of the things that the paper didn't necessarily focus on, but is something that I think Raleigh has done a really fantastic job in addressing, is the infrastructure that is built around the BRT. So I'm talking specifically more about pedestrian access, cycling access, and the city has like I said, has done a really fantastic job in making sure that that walkability and the ability to cycle through the corridor and around the corridor is a priority. So I really actually think that once these improvements have been made, Kim, that your children who are crossing Newbern and Edenton will actually have an easier time crossing those corridors than they actually than they do today because of those improvements. And I think we have to consider that all the infrastructure and and the fact that we are probably closer to the Cleveland model, that that silver model with all of the I think it's over 50% of all the the corridor having its own right of way and having all of the features that that Molly had mentioned before in the beginning of the presentation. And so less and less towards what Cleveland had had put in place. I mean, sorry, Pittsburgh had put in place. I don't want to get my Rust Belt cities confused.
Thank you, Evan. That's awesome. Kim, do you raise your hand again? Do you have yeah, please.
Well, I did. I do have one other question, or kind of a point. But I was also trying to learn how to put my hand down. I'm not like you guys. I don't sit on these awesome calls every day. Okay. So when I lived in Washington, D.C., I did use the park and ride to the metro, which is probably not called light rail in your industry, but it was fabulous. I mean, it was absolutely wonderful. But we did still have all of the sprawl. So, and when I say park and ride, that means I took a bus. So I parked out in Burtonsville and Northern Silver Spring, drove to a park and ride, got on the bus, and then took the bus to the metro in downtown Silver Spring and metroed into the CBD. And, I was single and everything and commuting, and it was great. And we didn't even have cell phones then, but it didn't address the whole point of people were going by. When we got into DC on the metro, it was all concrete. There was no trees. The only people who chose to live there were probably lower income. And I use choose very loosely. I'm sure that maybe they didn't feel it was not well kept. And it was kind of depressing to just sit there and look out the window in a lot of parts of it, but people would just skip over it. It didn't stop the sprawl because, I started in Silver Spring, and then rents would go up and we would move further north into Burtonsville and even Columbia. And I know that's part of it. But with the McMansions, I live next to some things. My house is very modest, and, we've got really nice townhomes being built, very expensive housing. And, even if it's a single family home, they're saving the trees. And I know that you're not in charge of the TOD, but when you read the TOD, which I did do several nights ago, yes, they're eliminating driveways, they're eliminating parking requirements, they're eliminating requirements for developers for trees. They're very minimal. And I just, is it our goal, or we are aware that we don't want to end up like downtown DC? We don't want to end up like New York, where we don't have trees and we don't have, I would rather live next to a McMansion if I had to choose. Right now, I just live next to my same neighbors. We've been here 23 years. And I would rather live next to that than like no big buildings with no trees, if that makes sense. And so I know you're not in charge of the TOD, but the park and ride to the light rail was fabulous. And I did, in between those two, take a bus. And culturally, it is different up there. But I just didn't want to slam the idea of park and rides because, I've been to Pittsburgh many times, and I know the Martin Luther King road that's there. And I think there's a whole lot of reasons why it is what it is. But I just feel like we're not asking people. We could just ask people. We could do, studies, but they're sociological in basis, probably more than data driven, but you can convert information like that into data. I just feel like we don't know what we're doing and we're just moving forward. And you guys are experts and fabulous. I'm not putting down this study, but it's like one study, and some of the things that are being said today don't match with my experience in Washington, DC. And then forget Atlanta, that was a hot mess, and I never want to be in that kind of traffic. But anyway, so that's just with the TOD situation. We're not going to have trees, and we have so much walkable. We walk everywhere down here. And why are we not working on improving the walkability from a safety standpoint or a well-lit standpoint? We're putting all this money into some unknowns where we know, we should be, as a city. And again, this isn't probably your area, but why are we not putting money into security relations with, police in neighborhoods and lifting up these neighborhoods? I can't walk 4 blocks from my house without having to think about things I don't want to think about. And, so there's just so many factors I've covered, but that's, the sprawl's not going to stop. But it makes me feel like the affordable housing, low to mid income people, we're being forced out with this instead of being able to live here and focus on things like walkability, connectivity. People don't really come down. I mean, yes, people do work downtown, but it's not a lot compared to my Atlanta and DC experience. People aren't upset about it. They have no problems getting parking. A parking space in downtown Raleigh is so easy compared to, DC or Atlanta, and it's certainly expensive. So I feel so at risk, I guess is the best way I can say it. And I'm not saying I disagree with you guys. I think you're a wonderful group. I remember what you did for public education, all those years ago, but I am scared. This is all I have is my home and my neighbors. And we have historic homes in our neighborhood. And I don't think one of them is listed historic, but it's scary because the city brought us here. They attract us. They please come downtown 25 years ago. Please, please, please. We need families. We need young professionals. We need teachers, police. And now we're experiencing something different with the BRT. And again, you're not in charge of zoning, but they already zoned us. And I talked to my neighbors, and not a single one of us realized we went from residential to mixed use. And I know that's not what this call is about, but it is still scary to be going down this BRT, very expensive road without more answers. And the last thing I'll say is everybody in my neighborhood, we support affordable housing. We absolutely support effective mass transit, but not buses for the sake of buses, because that's not working down here. Sorry for the long spiel.
No, you're great, and I appreciate that, and I think that's worthy of note. There are folks from city staff on this call that are listening, so I know that they will definitely take a lot of that to heart. And one thing I note is that there is time right now. The TOD is being discussed. It's going in front of the Planning Commission soon, in the next couple months. So your comment period actually is still open. So I definitely put those comments forward and let folks know, and let the Planning Commission and City Council know as as that moves forward, as that goes along the process, so your voice can be heard along that. We are, and I'm definitely not discounting, but we are now over time. So I want to acknowledge that it's 4:11, and I wanted to close this up so that we like to try to keep within our hour that we have, which is never enough time. But this conversation is going to be a continuing conversation. It's something that we are going to need to continue talking about. It is important for all of you to reach out to your elected officials and continue being sort of vocal on all parts of that, because even the best plans can be improved. So we are, and as this region grows, we need to be continuing to look at, what works and what's not, and making improvements and making changes. So I appreciate all of you for being part of this. Molly, thank you so much for lending your expertise and your experience with this, and your understanding, and really taking us through this study in a way that no one else could possibly do, and I appreciate that. We will see you all next month, the first Wednesday of the month, and of the month at 3 p.m. and for the next committee meeting. And we appreciate all our guests for joining us this afternoon, and have a wonderful March. And we appreciate your participation. Stay in touch with us and stay involved with WakeUp, and we appreciate your continued advocacy and continued work.
Thank you, everyone.